asked George to record this meeting. So he sees inside my mind. So let me go ahead and share my screen. This is probably way more formal than we need it to be, Denise, but thanks for bearing with me as I pull up what I need to pull up here. Sorry, don't look behind the curtain. Don't look behind the curtain. Anyway, so we're going to be talking today about how to make group work. The basic structure today is George and I have kind of divvied it up. So we'll start with introductions, but I think we can skip that since we all know who everyone is. Denise, you have met Hillary, right?
I certainly know of Hillary via emails and all of that. But I think we've met at one time, but if not, hello again, Hillary.
Okay, great. And then after those introductions, we'll start with George's tips, and those kind of focus a lot on Canvas, and then I'll focus on some tips, pedagogically speaking. And then along the way, if you have questions, just ask us, Denise. We're happy to answer any questions you have. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. We don't need that. I saw this is not coming up the way I'd like it to in terms of resolution, but this occurs to me of how this is how students see group work a lot of the time, is that they're all George, is that you who sees it this way?
I agree.
My mother for a long time was an academic and decided to leave academia and become a priest. So she now works at the National Cathedral. And when she was in seminary, I talked to my mother every day. And when she called me, it was often she would call me from seminary. And this is a woman who spent 40 years in academia. And she'd say, oh, group work today. You know, so she hated it as much as a lot of people do. So hopefully we're going to have some strategies today to kind of address these different archetypes, I guess is what you'd say, for group work. You know, the person who does it all, the person who never does anything, the person who, are they in the group or not? So we're going to talk about some different ways we might be able to address that. So George, why don't you go ahead? I'll stop sharing my screen, and why don't you go ahead and share your ideas with us?
All right, so we're going to take a look at, and that's the wrong one. This happens a lot in Zoom for me for some reason. Hold on. So talking about group work, I will be the first to admit that I'm one of those people who never really appreciated it, because I was that person who did like most of the work. I'm kind of overly conscientious. Probably some of you know that about me. And I would jump in and try and get stuff done. And there would be some point I would reach probably that I would just be like, nobody's doing anything. I'll just do it myself and just move on. So I'm not the best person to talk about group work, but as Karin said, we're going to split these things up and talk about. I understand pedagogically the all the implications for it. I know the applications for it. I know that it can work in a lot of situations, but I haven't been on the receiving end of that in a lot of cases. I watched my son. I will say I watched my son do it very effectively. As he was going through the adult degree completion program at EMU, and they worked almost exclusively in groups when they weren't in class, their one long night of class in their cohort, and that was kind of an eye opener for me, because they made it work and they did a great job of it. So I don't know, Denise, let me ask you a couple of questions before we get started. Have you done groups in Canvas before?
Yes,
okay.
I have used them to assign groups for like a project that was due. So I've done, groups of 3s and 4s, and then in one of my classes that starts this weekend, I just was going to smaller groups.
Mm-hmm.
To kind of address, the topic you all are bringing, does a smaller group mean that people have to work more? Or, I'm hoping that instead of putting in groups of 3s and 4s, and that allows 1 or 2 to slough off, that maybe a smaller group, they have to be more accountable, I'm hoping.
Well, I think I can address that. So looking at the research, Denise, it might surprise you. I know it surprised me, is that the most effective grouping for group work is actually trios. So groups of 3 is what the research supports. It's got, some sort of critical factor, it really outstrips anything. I would never recommend for groups anything larger than 4, maybe 5, but a lot of it depends on what it is that they're working on and how long they have to work on it, right? So when I have used groups, for example, I typically I like to use groups a lot of different ways in a course, but typically starting with the very first class session, I put people into groups and they stay in that group for a semester-long project, right? So we start week 1, and they meet in some way, shape, form, or fashion all the way through to week 15 in that group. Now, along the way, we do different pairings and we do trios, and I allow them to self-select and I select. But that's one way, especially when the project is really big, to kind of have a permanent group all semester long or for a big chunk of the semester. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'd also be interested in hear what strategies you use, because there's always that one group, even though it's a semester-long project, they wait until the week that, like 2 days
Right.
before
Right.
it's due and the end of the semester. So,
Right.
Do you make maybe references due earlier? Do you make them submit something midterm just to kind of encourage?
So I think that's a great question. I guess my first question to you would be, are we talking about undergraduate students or are we talking about graduate students?
This, my example I'm thinking of is undergrad.
Okay, so for undergrad, my suggestion would be to chunk and to scaffold. So for example, when I work with undergraduates in the teacher ed program, I have a project called the Ideal School Project, right? And I actually use it with the graduate students too. But when I share it with undergraduates, I split it up into 15 weeks of different tasks. So each week, and I give them dedicated class time or, some sort of way to let them know that that's part of the class session is that they need to meet. And each week I give them a different task. Now, they don't turn in anything to me. I don't check anything. Of course, I check in and I ask, do you need help? All that kind of stuff. But then each week I chunk it and scaffold it so that by the time we get to the end, they've done all the 15 pieces that need to be done, if that makes sense. With graduate students, what I do is I have the same project and I say, this is a course I've taught asynchronously, for example, with the 15-week Ideal School Project. What I'll say is, I don't mandate that they meet any sort of time, but I'll say it's suggested that this week you work on this topic. Now, whether or not they decide to wait until the night before, that's up to them. I mean, it's a huge project, right? So I wouldn't recommend it. But with graduate students, I say, this is what I suggest. But with undergraduates, I say, this is what you need to be working on. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, just if we'll just, I'll kind of run through this. Since you've done it before, you probably know Canvas requires you to do 2 steps, which has always been kind of a problem for me. I don't like this, but nobody asked me, and every time I give them my opinion, they seem to ignore me. So you do have to create a group set to start with, and you'll see I'm in the people area of my course, which you already know, obviously. Let me go back here just a second. Hopefully it will load up sometime today. There we go. I have 2 group sets set up here already, but I'm going to start from the beginning and set a group set up. And as Karen was talking about, if this was, a full semester project, I might just call it a semester project or something like that. So that's going to be the group set. And within that group set, there are going to be groups. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Karen and I talked yesterday about the differences between allowing self sign up and manually putting people into your groups. So you can allow self sign up and you can give it a structure by saying how many groups you're going to have. So if I had, let's see how many students I have, like 7, I think, in this class. So I might do 3 groups like so, and I would limit the groups to 3 because I know I'm going to have a leftover somewhere along the line. And then here's another little thing that we'll talk a little bit more about after we get out of the mechanics here. I can assign a student leader automatically, and I can let it be either the first student who joins. Some people say that that's usually your, most gung-ho kind of person and maybe the best person to do the leading. You can also set it at random, and you can also deselect that button altogether, and then manually assign the group leader as you're going along. There's a way, but I'll show you where that is in just a minute. So I'm going to leave that undone for right now. I'm going to click on save. And in this semester project, it did not put my students in there. Oh, self sign up. I made it self sign up. Sorry.
What's the benefit of naming a group leader?
Good question. I think the benefit would be that you can assign somebody possibly to be the group leader to just sort of make sure that people are doing what they're doing, what they need to do, and they can report back to you maybe for the whole group. They can also be the person who does the submissions as time goes on, because as you create group assignments, you only get one document or one submission for the whole group. So it could be the group leader that you expect to get that from and do the grading and so forth. That makes grading simpler and things like that. So in this respect, these people would all sign up for the project things. I want to show you a couple of things. I'm going to go back to some of these ones that I created before. Let's look at this labs chapter 1. So this is one that hasn't been assigned yet, and I can go ahead and I can either do this, drag and drop into the groups that I want, like so, and you'll notice that the numbers are going up in each one. I'm just going to randomly put some of these people over here. You can also do it like this, add, okay, I lied. There it is. If you hit that little button, it asks which one do you want to put it into, and you can do it like so. Anyway. Drag and drop is obviously easier. I don't know if you've ever noticed this. I find when I'm talking to people about groups that they don't know this exists because it's kind of hidden. If you notice over here, these three little dots down here will give you a contextual menu. Notice it says visit group homepage. Your students actually have access to their own homepage here. And so within that homepage, anything that you've assigned to them as far as a discussion board, maybe a discussion forum that you've assigned to a group. If you've done an assignment, it would show up. So those things will all show up here, and they can come right to their homepage. They see that as part of a group. They can come right to their homepage and go right into the discussion that you've given them without going to the discussions on the main thing. If they've got a lot of active things going on within their group, they can come here and participate in all those things as sort of I think what it does for me is it sort of visually puts it all into one place, that I'm doing all this group work over here, but the rest of the class stuff is over here in the other part of the class. So some people think that's an advantage. I think it might be an advantage. What really bothers me most about it is that it's not intuitive to know where it is for an instructor, for instance. I'm going to get out of that and go back here to my course. And we're going to go back to people really quickly. So anyway, talking about group sets, you think of those as sort of categories. I kind of feel like you can use those group sets differently. I know the clinical groups in our health professions, for instance, will set up, they have different clinical groups that go out and do, their clinical rotations or whatever, and they use groups a lot for those. And they allow for their own sort of discussion boards and so forth within those groups. While I'm thinking about discussions, I want to take you one place and show you also another hidden thing that's in Canvas that's important for group discussions. If you'll notice, I need to move this. Hold on one second. If you'll notice in the settings of your course, if you go to course details, and at the very bottom, there's a little button that says more options. There's a button here that says let students attach files to discussions. That's important if they're doing something where, I don't know, they were working collectively on a single document. They could exchange parts of that document back and forth. and this one right here, let students create their own discussion topics. So that allows them to not have to wait for you to create a forum in the discussion board for them to respond to, but they can do their own within their groups. Now, there are other things here that don't really necessarily have that much to do with groups, but I'm going to save that just so that you know that that's out there. And obviously, you said you had done this before. If you're creating a discussion for a particular group, I'm just going to walk through these processes really quickly, and then we'll go on to pedagogical.
George, may I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
Do you ever not allow students to edit their posts? Because that was one of the options down there.
That's a good question. If I did it, and I've told people this all along, my personal philosophy is that I would not allow them to edit posts.
Yeah.
And my reasoning is that I think that we need to get used to the fact that when we put something into writing, that it's there and that you can't take it back, or you can't go back and delete it. And I think I would communicate that at the beginning of class if that were my philosophy and I was going to do that. I know some people like students to be able to edit their posts. So I think it all has to do with your own teaching philosophy and your methodology. I was going to say, does that answer your question, Denise? Okay, cool. If you're adding a discussion and you want it to be for a specific group, you can do it right from the regular discussion board. And in your options, hopefully this will drop down. There we go. And your options, again, you would select make it a group discussion. You would select the group that you want it to go to, and then give them the availability dates and so forth. So same thing with doing assignments. I'm going to leave this really quickly. And again, for your students who have that assignment or that discussion, those will only show up for them. If you're grading the assignments and or discussion boards for those students, only the group that has that discussion will have an open cell in the grade book when you're doing the grading, and so the other people are grayed out. So if if you're mixing up assignments with different groups and so forth, just know that you can equitably hand them out by giving each group an assignment, but the others are not penalized for not doing the assignments to which they're not assigned. So here we are, we're going to add another assignment. My computer always works a little slowly here when I'm on Zoom. And you've seen this before, I'm sure. If you scroll down here and you select this is a group assignment, you start getting more options. So this is one of those things with the assignments, particularly, that if you select this, you're going to assign each student individually a grade. I'm not sure what your metrics are going to be for doing that, but understand that you can give them all an individual grade. If you know little Mary did all the work and little Johnny sat back in the corner and didn't do anything, then you can certainly do that. And this is editable, by the way. You can come back and change this if you make up your mind to do it later in the game. You can come back to it. But here's where we would choose, again, the group set. And then when we're assigning down here, we select which group we want it to go to. And so each group, you can make this the same assignment for every group, that they're all working on exactly the same thing, and just give each one, we're going to take everyone else away, give each one their own due date and availability date individually by clicking the add button. So I'm going to check, now I'm going to give this group theirs. And let's say you have a project and they're all it's going to culminate with each one of those groups doing their own presentation or something in class. This is another way that you might use this with a different availability date and or due dates, like so. Does that make sense? Any questions about any of that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. You've done a lot of that, I'm sure, already. If you, let me go back really quickly just to make sure I cover a couple of things here. I'm looking at my notes to make sure I didn't leave stuff out. In your groups, see if I can make this obvious. So you remember I put people in groups here a while ago. I can open up these groups like so and see who all is in the groups. And if I decide from now that I want to create or manually set the leaders, I just wanted to make sure I showed you where that was. So you can do it from the little contextual menu from the students themselves. So if Alvin's going to be my leader in this group, and Richie's going to be the leader in this group, and Hillary will be the leader in this group. Hillary, you got to be on your toes now. So, so that's how that manually gets set if you didn't ask Canvas to do that for you at the beginning.
So George, if I had asked Canvas, just going back to what Karin said about groups of 3 as opposed to 2, if I've already set groups of 2, can I go in right here and add people, or will I need to probably go back into the original?
You can edit them. Like I can go right here right now and I can edit these people, and I can add another group in here if I need it, and it would be group 4 or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So even though I originally set it up to be groups of 2, I can just move people around. I don't have to start it over.
That's right. That's correct. You can always move people around. The problem will be if they've already done an assignment in their group. That will get you it'll be really tricky when you're doing grading and stuff. So I wouldn't recommend it after that. But if you're part of the way into the semester and you feel like they're not working or something like that. And Denise, I will tell you, if it were me, I would probably just negate that group and just start over, because I think the mechanics of stuff in the background and the way Canvas works with users, I can't tell you that it would work perfectly or that it wouldn't work, but my logic would tell me I would just do it over again, probably, just to alleviate any possible issues.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And I think I've done everything. Options, yeah. I think that's all. And certainly, I'm always around. If you need help when you're doing any of this, just give me a holler, and I'll be glad to help any way I can. And I will stop sharing and turn it over to you, Karin.
Thanks, George. Before we totally move out, or not totally, but partially move out of the Canvas and how to set up groups in Canvas, George talked about allowing students to self-select groups. And I would just say, pedagogically speaking, at least in my experience, that I only allow students to choose a partner. I do not allow students to choose groups, because then I find it becomes invariably there's, the 5, I might say choose a group of 4, and then it'll be, the 5 of us really want to work together. And that leaves 2 people without a partner. And typically the people who students choose to work with are not necessarily the best in terms of making sure they stay on task and things. So that's why if I use that self-select, I only do it for partnerships, because then I guess I don't want to say it's controlling collateral damage, but it is controlling to some degree that those other issues that come up when you self-select. Hillary, did you want to add something to that?
No, I just wanted to ask you about that little element of social engineering, whether you think that that's appropriate, or do you just kind of randomize your groups? Because, generally at the point I assign groups, I know majors, I know career interests, and I'll often ask them if they know anyone in the class, just to sort of get a feel for, who my students are. But then I don't know, like, helpful or no, to try to put together people in some sort of way that I hope will be helpful for them and, help them work through the course material together.
I think that's another great question. And my advice would be this. I'm a big believer in variety is the spice of life. So it is very, very rare in a class where I do anything the same way twice, other than how I structure my course in Canvas. So I try to I actually keep a little chart to myself and I say, have I given students a chance to work in pairs? Have I given them a chance to pick for themselves? Haven't I given it, have I socially engineered it, so to speak, to have a strong with people who maybe aren't as strong in the content? Have I allowed them to choose majors? So I try to mix it up a lot. Is there some degree of, I guess the caution I would make is I try to be very careful about not putting a stronger student with a bunch of students who maybe aren't as strong, because that puts additional pressure on that strong student to kind of make sure that everyone's kind of coming along together and working at the same pace and, completing the tasks. That causes a lot of pressure on that person, but it can cause resentment. It can be like, well, he or she is just going to do all the work anyway. So I try to avoid that as much as I can, because I found that almost, in my experience at least, it backfires. So does that answer your question, or do we need to talk about other options?
Yeah, no, that was very, very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So why don't I pull up my tips, because unlike George, I have to have visual reminders up in my face. So let's talk about a few things that I think are really helpful when thinking about group work. And so Denise, before we get started though, before we go to those suggestions, and Hillary, I'd be really curious to know, what are some of the things that you experienced that with group work that you wish could be different, or that you have always kind of had at the back of your mind, gee, is there a way to fix this? Denise, would you mind going first?
Well, other than the fact that students tend to grumble about group work, but that doesn't bother me a whole lot. I think the main thing was what I asked earlier, and then you offered a solution to that, is that there's always every semester that one group that starts the night before something's due. And so I think now having a strategy to offset that would probably, I think that'll address that issue. But otherwise, I mean, just making sure I have a good rubric and those type of things. But I don't think there's any other concerns.
Karen, you're muted.
Well, I just said the most brilliant thing, don't you know? I apologize. I was asking Hillary, is there anything that for you comes up as something that, you run groups and you think to yourself, oh, is there a different way to do it? Is there something I could be doing differently? Does that apply to you when you're working with groups?
Well, you've already given me two suggestions that I think are going to make a big difference. And that was the idea of the trios. And then what you just said about strengths, and I'm just thinking through recent experiences and wondering, oh yeah, I wonder if that would have helped with that particular group, because I tend to do with Zoom breakouts. I was able to go in and really spend some time with each of the groups during activities, and they all had their own sort of like willingness to express when they were having challenges. And I think that was probably a lot of what was going on when students wouldn't say that they did in fact have questions, is because they were with somebody who really got it and was kind of just racing forward. So I'm going to pay much more attention to that now. Thank you.
Sure. I thought that was a really good point, because I have to admit that I've always thought the opposite. I've always thought that I didn't want them to self-select, because I didn't want all the strong students to migrate towards one another and then have all the weaker students left over and fend for themselves together. But Karen, I never thought that otherwise, that puts more pressure on the stronger student, and probably the weaker student gets away with more. So that definitely turned my thinking around on.
You know, that it's so interesting because I told you sort of my story at the beginning, but that was exactly kind of what happened to me in my English classes in college. Was I would be put with a bunch of students, and I mean, the teacher actually told me she was putting me with a bunch of students who really needed extra help, and I was basically tutoring. And so that was a kind of eye opener for me, and I really didn't like it. It happened sort of in biology classes too, because I was pretty good at biology, and I always ended up being lab leader in my group. So um, yet, you know, it seems to me really obvious, and that you need to have some balance of all of that. I think you need to get um, I don't know. I just feel like once you learn to know the students a little bit, and you understand what their capacities are a little bit, then I think some balance of all of that is just the best way to work that out if you can do that.
Mhm.
I would agree. And so I think that idea of in Canvas saying, oh, the first person to sign up to be is the leader is great some of the time, but then other times I would say who volunteers to be the leader in this group. I think just because, you know, you're the person on the spot doesn't necessarily mean that that should sign you up for everything right off the bat. And then I think that sometimes can prevent students from wanting to take on leadership roles or to be first to do something because they're afraid of what that's going to mean. Okay, so let's look at some other ideas for group work. So I think probably the biggest mistake that I have seen, so, you know, when I was an elementary school teacher or even in teacher ed, I've seen hundreds, if not thousands of teachers teach, right? Different kinds of lessons. And probably I think the biggest mistake that people make is they say, okay, now go work in your groups. And that's it. And so there's no other structure given. And I think we assume that people know how to work in groups, but I think that's really actually not a natural skill that everyone suddenly understands what needs to happen. There will sometimes be students who have natural leadership skills and can kind of figure it out, but there will be other students who really don't know, right? So I was thinking about that as I came up with some different tips. I might skip around this page a little bit here, but let's talk first about assigning roles. I do think it's important to have at least a leader for a group. I would recommend other roles as well. So you can have someone, for example, on that Canvas, the group homepage for Canvas, be the person who takes the notes, and that person can be the same person every time, or you can switch it up. The person who, if you come out of breakout rooms and the group is coming back together to discuss, there's a speaker for the group, a reporter, someone who keeps time. There can be a liaison. So if you're working in a breakout room, for example, this is the dedicated person who pops out or asks the professor a question. So having those kind of designated roles for group members can be really, really helpful, because then they know what they need to be doing to contribute to the group's success, right? Otherwise, it can be sometimes the leader gets into the group and says, okay, you do this, you do that, you do that. Okay, but that doesn't really allow anyone else to have some sort of accountability or some sort of role. They've just been kind of handed, it's been kind of assigned to them, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to skip over to co-authoring the experience. I think another thing that we often think about when we say, oh, go work in groups, is that everyone might come to a group with a different idea of what makes a group actually work, right? So some people are like, listen, I just like to sit back. I'm waiting for somebody to tell me what to do. Other person might say, no, we got to get on this right away. And so I think it can be helpful at the beginning, and Denise, speaking to your point about rubrics, is to co-author what it is that group time will, how it will be used, how it will be used effectively. And if you have time, have some sort of collaborative experience for a rubric for keeping people accountable in group work, if that makes sense. So you could have a discussion about what could we do to, you know, what are your worst experiences, because people love their worst experiences, right? You know, what would make this just, what would make group work really fail for us, or what has failed for you in the past? And then looking at that and working together to craft, well, what's the opposite of that? And you can use that to craft a rubric that, for example, when you go down here and think GOAT for accountability, that might be the rubric that you use that every week or every 2 weeks, the group has to check in and rate themselves on how they're doing using that rubric that everyone's decided upon. Or it could be a separate discussion board post that you put into their group saying, how's the group doing? You know, are you maintaining accountability according to the expectations that we set for ourselves? So I think that can also be a really helpful tool. I think one of the things, the longer I've been in the biz, so to speak, is that the more management, the more engagement, right? So the more management that you do, it seems kind of counterintuitive, the higher the engagement, because you're thinking through what those pitfalls are. And because it's so much easier, right, to say, okay, everybody go work in your groups. But if you start thinking about what you have to do to support those groups and, you know, make that work, that's a lot more management, but I find that it really pays off in terms of student engagement and interactivity and all of those kinds of good things that we're going for. So any questions about that one or thoughts? Okay. So let's go to GOAT. So every time you have a group work session, or, you know, whether it's 15 minutes of class time or they're doing it asynchronously out of class, and, you know, they just have a week to complete a task or something, for every sort of time that you put people in groups and ask them to work together, you should be thinking about the GOAT. Okay. So there should be a very specific goal, right? So it should be in this group. So thinking back to our previous example, I was talking about scaffolding, let's say for undergraduates, I would say in this session, you need, so for, let me use the example of the, in teacher ed, we used a ideal school project, right? And so over 15 weeks, they had to look at different aspects of K-12 education and kind of create a school based on their ideal. Now, the ideal project is one of my favorite projects because there's so much you can do with it, but we can talk about that later. Anyway, so when I'm working with undergraduates and I say, your goal for this session for the ideal school project, this semester-long project, is in this session, you are creating your school's name and mission statement. Boom. It's very clear what it is they need to be doing, how they decide to achieve it, whether it's in that 15-minute period or if it's an asynchronous week. That's the goal for that week. So that's very clear. If you give them a huge project and say, get started, it's too much. We need to bound it in some way. And you need to have some sort of outcome. So even if it's just posting to discussion board or posting it to the group homepage in Canvas or something, you know, keep notes for themselves of what's happening. There needs to be, this is what I expect to come out of this session, right? So for example, if I say the goal is you're going to create your school's mission statement and name, then I would think by the end of that group work session that I'm going to see, if I was going to look in Google Drive or something, that I would see a school name and a mission statement. If there weren't, then I would know that I would need to go back to that group and say, what's going on? Where's your mission statement, or where's your, you know, whatever. So you need to have those outcomes. For every session, you need to have some sort of accountability. Now, whether this is posting, I know Denise, you've been interested in this idea of a reflective journal, you know, whether it's, you know, posting to a journal saying this is how it went this week, or to a discussion board, or they're filling out a Google form on each other or on the process. There needs to be some way that they're all kind of keeping themselves and the group in check so that, oh, you know, Dr. Massey hasn't forgotten, or Professor Sordor hasn't forgotten, you know, she's going to ask me this, I'd better make sure I know what I'm going to do. So there's that sense of I'm accountable, right? And so this is my biggest pet peeve with working in groups, is we get down to like week 12 or week 13 and someone says, I didn't want to say this earlier, but so-and-so hasn't been showing up to groups. I'm like, you know, so that's what I'm trying to avoid, because that's my pet peeve. So everything I'm suggesting here is trying to avoid that. End of this semester, who knows who's been doing what sort of thing. And then I think the other thing that's really important about class sessions or group work and class sessions is bounding it by time, right? You know, say you have 15 minutes, you have 20 minutes, you have the full class session, you know, should meet, you know, if it's an asynchronous class or an asynchronous component, this should take you between 30 minutes to an hour to complete. Giving them some sort of time expectation really helps them with metacognition, in the sense of, hey guys, she said this is only should take 60 minutes, and for the past 45 minutes, we haven't gotten to it yet, right? So that bounding it with time is really, really helpful to keep themselves on track. if that makes sense. So any questions about the GOAT?
Maybe, so the difference between the outcomes and the accountability.
So the outcomes for me would be, this is what I expect to see in your Google folder, you know, let's say for a big project. And I would say I have access to everyone's folder. And I would say at the end of the session, I'm expecting to see something in Google Drive that talks about, you know, who your team members are and what your team name is and what your team cheer is, or whatever it is, you know, that I want them to do. The accountability, so, is built into those outcomes, but I would also have something like a Google form, a discussion board post where they have to think about their progress and the group's progress. So the best groups, in addition to working in trios, the best groups have independence and they have interdependence, right? So for every sort of thing that gets graded on a group, so, you know, that has a group to work on it, there should be an individual level of accountability and, you know, maybe if you want to attach a grade to that, but you can, but there should be an individual level and there should be that interdependence, that group level. Because otherwise, if there's no reason that, you know, you're going to get graded as a group or graded as an individual, it's much easier to be like, well, I'm just going to do my part and I don't really care what happens next, right? So you're trying to kind of promote that I have a role, I know what my role is, and my role is integral to how this whole group is going to work and how whether or not we're going to succeed. So that's where that accountability piece comes in. Does that make sense, Denise? Okay, good. I like your live emoji rather. That's awesome. All right, so certainly if you, let's switch over to considering the options, and I don't think there's any, one of the great things about teaching is that there are no hard and fast rules, but like one of the worst things about teaching is that there are no hard and fast rules. So there are lots of things to think about when considering group work. Like certainly we've talked a little bit about group size. So research indicates that, boy, I hate that phrase, but you know, what is that called? Meta-analysis of research says trios are the most effective, but you probably don't want to go over 5. But a lot of that depends upon the size of your class, right? And so you want to be thinking about, you know, if you only have 8 people in a class, a group of 5 makes no sense. So obviously, but then when you get larger, that gets to be a little bit of a little bit more tricky. There is that, I do like the idea of having both instructor chosen and student chosen. So I think that there's something to be said for the more that you can give students choice, the more it empowers and engages. That's great. And I think certainly for any class, there should be permanent groups and there should be rotating groups. If you are a huge class, like, you know, some of our classes here are 60 to or more people, I would stick with permanent groups only, because rotating really then becomes more about the management and not about the group work, right? So if you have a huge class, I'd say this group of 4 is going to work together all semester long. So whenever we have a discussion prompt, whenever we have a such and so, I'm going to say, get in your groups and do this task, and it's going to be the same people every time. I think if you have a class of 20 or smaller, 30 or smaller, then you can do some more rotation, if that makes sense. But those are things that you want to think about with the groups. You know, I'm a big believer in variety is the spice of life when it comes to pedagogical approaches. So that's just the advice I would give about groups. Any questions about that, or insights that you'd like to share from your own experience?
No.
Okay. Fabulous. All right. So one of the things I think is great about Zoom, especially in terms of group work and really supporting group work, is the use of the whiteboard in Zoom. And I think one of the features I really like about the whiteboard in Zoom is that you can take that whiteboard creation, whatever it is that students have created together in their group, and this kind of speaks back to accountability, is you can make a PDF of that. They can make a PDF of that and then either share it with their other group members, they can share it with you. So for example, if you have a group work task that is, you need to outline chapter 6 for the upcoming midterm exam, and you have students go into a breakout room and use the whiteboard, and they come up with their study guide for chapter 6, they can PDF it, share it with you, and then you can share it with everyone else. So that kind of relates into that accountability, is that they have something they have to deliver for the group. But there are lots of different ways you can use that whiteboard, but I think that save it as a PDF function has really got some very cool implications in terms of making sure that groups do the work that they need to be doing. Has anybody tried the PDF in breakout rooms?
No, I haven't.
I
I
haven't.
never have.
I haven't, and it sounds like a great idea. And it also just reminds me of how much I need to do at the beginning of the semester to support that, because just thinking back to what the last semester was like, the students don't always know how to use these tools,
No.
and I don't want to overlook that.
I agree. And I think this is, like I say, it requires management of a lot of different kinds. And I think that your comment raises that. I think if you are using group work and you do have those roles assigned, having something like the whiteboard and saying, well, if it's the note taker or whoever, that's the person who PDFs it and gets it to the professor or gets it to everyone else. And that could be, you could even call that role something as, obvious as the whiteboard saver, or whatever you want to call it, because one of the great things about sharing the whiteboard is that it can be a PDF or it can be either a JPEG or a PNG. So it can be an image or it can be a PDF. And what would be cool is if you could take an image and they put it up on the discussion board for the whole class to see.
Mhm.
And then, so you can incorporate visuals into discussion boards. So there are really some very cool things that could be done, but keeping the group accountable for a piece of something. So they have that independence, but there's also interdependence. So we have chapter 6 to work on, but everyone else in the class is relying on us for chapter 6. And so having those two levels for group work really makes a big difference in terms of whether or not it will succeed. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Sure, of course. All right, so last but not least, I think another thing that I know I have often overlooked it with group work is taking the time to make sure that that students know one another and can work together. I think it's oftentimes, with graduate students, it might be a little bit different because, they have a little bit more, in theory, life experience, but especially with undergraduates, you can't overlook that they need time to get to know one another and kind of get a sense of who each other is before we can put them into groups and ask them to work together, right? I mean, I think that's something we often overlook because I know I have done it many, many times. I'm so concerned with getting started on the content or making sure we get everything and all that stuff that I forget that, they're strangers with nothing in common except for the fact that they're just all sitting in the same class at the same time. And so kind of spending time with icebreakers or getting them to do things together that they present to the rest of the class. I really like to have, I like to open classes with some sort of fun activity. So it's like the warm-up activity. So I'll assign it to groups. So there's that independence, they've got their group, but then we're all relying on them to lead us in an opening activity or an exercise or something like that. And that really kind of builds that sense of group and team and kind of working together successfully. So I think when they have those kind of lower risk and low stakes opportunities to work together and do it successfully, then that really helps when it counts and a grade's involved. That really kind of helps build that, that trust and that reliability, if that makes sense. Did I get them all? I think I did. So any thoughts or questions on any of these?
No, very helpful. Yeah.
Okay, good.
I feel much more excited about group work now.
Well, that's nice of you to say. I'm glad you feel that way. I mean, I think Canvas and pedagogy, I think there's some really, they work hand in hand. And so all of these things are things that you can do in Canvas, right? Like these are things that you can arrange in Canvas, organize in Canvas, you use the groups, you do this, so they really do go hand in glove very nicely. I think my last slide is really just, do you have questions? So are there any other thoughts or questions? Are there issues thinking back to the fall semester with groups that maybe you're like, ooh, do you have any ideas about that? I think we have maybe a minute or two left.
No, I just think for me is just, just thinking outside the box, being a little more creative with the type of, assignments that I'm making, other than a group presentation, what can I So I think for me, it's just that creativity and just having to think outside the box a little bit.
Yeah, I think, Denise, if you can figure out a way to make it work with your content area, I really do suggest the ideal blank project. So, because it requires, so much, obviously it requires evaluation skills. So it's way up there in the higher order thinking skills. It's got create. So in teacher ed, we did the ideal school. And so we would say, what do we look at for staff, the building, the curriculum, all these different elements. And it was a very creative and, exercise. And so it's one of my favorites, the ideal, the ideal this, the ideal that, really gets students to, they have to talk about, well, what is your ideal? What do you think? So I think it's a really good kind of starter project, especially if you can make it last for 15 weeks. It's pretty cool.
Do you find that that would work as well for undergrad as grad? I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and when I get down to group presentations for something like that, or these semester long projects, so typically, for example, with the ideal school, and there are other examples, but that's the one that's currently in my mind, is they would have a video. So the idea was the rest of us in the class were parents and families of students who might go to that school. So they had a video, like what is that called? An ad on TV where they make you try to buy infomercial. So kind of like an infomercial, but then they would also have to create a brochure to go along with it that we all had a copy of. So it was this, so there was that role play element to it. And the undergraduates, I mean, honestly, you can't really tell in the end the difference between their work and graduate students' work. You know what I mean? Like, because if you've bounded it and scaffolded it all the way along, it's the same sort of
Yeah.
level of quality, if that makes sense.
Okay. Great.
Sure. And you can use it synchronously or asynchronously, right? So any of these work when I'm teaching in person synchronously, I would always set aside some class time for, for groups to work together, because I think that that's a lot of so many of our undergraduates are taking like 22 credits. And so allowing them some class time, even if it was 10 or 15 minutes to work on a group project, was really, really helpful. But asynchronously, I would give it to undergraduates and graduates and say, you have a week to work on this topic. When you work on it is totally up to you, right? So if your group wants to meet at 2 a.m, go for it,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Great.
Okay. All right. Well, Denise, I know Hillary's gone on to our next meeting, but if you have any questions or anything as you kind of are thinking through these ideas, both George and I know I speak for George, we're both available if you want to talk through something, or if you have some ideas you want to bounce around, we're definitely here for you if you need us.
Thank you. I always appreciate both of you very much.
Well, we appreciate you.
Denise.
Thanks so much for being here. George, can you stop recording and we'll sign off? Denise, have a